Hey, y'all, we're back. It's a new year, and I hope you all had a great new year. I actually recorded this case prior to the new year and was planning on putting it out then, but unfortunately, due to some computer issues, I was unable to. Today's case will talk about sexual sadism, rape, and torture. We're going to go into depth in the depraved mind of someone who does not want to cause any pleasure, but instead cause pain. These cases are some of the toughest cases to talk about, and today's case is described as one of the worst in New Mexico history. That being said, let's jump right on in and get going. David Parker Ray began his life in not the best of circumstances. On November 6th, 1939, in Belen, New Mexico, when Nettie and Cecil Ray welcomed David into the world. His namesake came from David's uncle, who had died at 13, had been accidentally shot in the heart by his 15-year-old brother, Alvin. This event would take place just 1 year before David was born. And his grandmother would go on to say that David was the reincarnation of her son. David's father was an abusive alcoholic who beat David, his sister Peggy, and his mother. His sister was born in 1942, and his parents would end up getting divorced when David was just 10 years old. He and his sister would move in with his fundamentalist Christian grandparents, and during this time, their parents really wouldn't come around very much. It was said that they had no nurturing, meaningful relationship with the children at all. With his grandparents' strict rules, David said that he did not get much attention or affection from them either. There was no real nurture and building of attention and love for the children in this house. The children were required to dress and act a certain way, to include ranch chores before and after school. David often got made fun of at school, though, because he had to follow these strict rules even when not at home. He feared that his grandfather would punish him physically if he did not follow the rules even when outside the home. He was very soft spoken and shy, and especially with the girls around him. The boys at school would bully David due to the fact that he would wear his shirts completely buttoned all the way to his neck, unlike the other boys in school who would leave a few buttons open at the top. David would go on to say that his shyness and fear for physical punishment would cause him to not even have his first kiss until he was 18 years old. David was not alone, though, as he found friendship in a neighbor who would stand up for him. The neighbor would go on to say that David could definitely defend himself, but did not believe in violence. The friend would say that even he was afraid of David's grandfather. Between the abuse at home and the abuse at school, it was mentally weighing on him. When his father would come to visit, he would bring David gifts. These gifts would come in the form of true crime magazines as well as sadistic bondage pornography. As his mental health declined, he began to combine this BDSM pornography from his father with alcohol and drugs. And this formed a very unhealthy obsession with sexual fantasies of rape, torture, and even murder. When he was 14, Peggy would actually find his pornography collection, and this would cause them to have an estranged relationship going forward. Though David was going through all of this, after graduating high school, he would end up cleaning up his act and joining the Army, where he became a general mechanic. He would go on to receive an honorable discharge, and being a mechanic just came second nature to him. His mechanic work would begin when he was a teenager after being gifted an electric motorcycle from his grandparents. He would then go on to help children at school who needed help with their motorcycles and other things that needed work. He was great at what he did, and it was even said that he would teach those around him willingly. In 1959, he would marry his first wife, and soon after their marriage, he would be sent to Korea with the army. And in 1960, his son would be born. He would soon be sent home, though, because his wife was caught leaving their infant alone to go party and do whatever she wanted to do. David would file for divorce and sue for full custody of the child. According to his ex wife, though, he was not innocent in the marriage either. He allegedly admitted to her in 1957 that he had kidnapped a woman, tied her to a tree, and tortured and murdered her. But police were never really able to verify this account. His ex wife also stated that through their marriage, he became increasingly disturbing in his behavior, and that this led to the end of their marriage and not his side, where she was going out partying and leaving their child unattended. In 1962, he did have a short 3-month marriage, which was, according to sources, dissolved because they could not get along. And in 1966, he would marry for the third time. This time, the marriage lasted 15 years to Glenda Burdine. And in 1969, they had a daughter named Glenda Jean, and she went by Jessie. They also did have another daughter, but her name was not found. And I believe that's because she really wants nothing to do with this whole situation. Jesse would actually go on to call the FBI in 1986, stating that her father was abducting, torturing, and selling girls to Mexico buyers. But the FBI said that the allegations were too vague to arrest him. Jessie would say that in her childhood, her father was gone a lot and he worked often. David would go on to divorce Glenda and get married one last time, but I was not able to find the information for his last wife. Up until the 1970s, David would work various blue collar jobs, a lot of them being mechanic jobs. And in the 1970s and 80s, however, he relocated to the small, quiet outdoor town of Elephant Butte, New Mexico, so he could be closer to his job as a maintenance worker for the New Mexico Parks Department, just 5 miles away in the town of Truth and Consequences, New Mexico. David purchased a parcel of land for his trailer as well as storage um, and other trailers along a 200-mile man made lake in Elephant Butte called Elephant Butte Lake. This area was very popular for boating, camping, hiking, bird watching, and all of those kind of things, as it was very peaceful. It was in the middle of the desert, and you could just enjoy the day. His neighbors described him as helpful, and they said that he would engage in the local community regularly. With the location of Elephant Butte and Truth and Consequences being in the middle of the desert, however, drifters, sex workers, and homelessness was very prevalent. With the prevalence of the homeless and the sex workers and the drifters, crime was on the rise, with assault and murders even higher. In 1997, David would meet 37-year-old Cindy Hendy. She was at the state park that he worked at, and she was on the run for grand theft and drug charges in Washington state. And that is where she had originally started her life. They started the romantic relationship and they moved in together on his property in Elephant Butte in his double wide trailer. With it being just David for so long, he was able to build a great savings account. And David and Cindy really bonded over their fantasies of bondage and violent sexual acts. Now, with two of them together and their fantasies aligned, the two of them set out to build their toy box. With David's savings, they would spend over $100,000. Before I go into the trailer and its contents, I am going to give a secondary trigger warning, as we are going to get a little in depth into what was actually in there, and it is not pleasant. I am letting you know now so you can skip ahead if you would like. The trailer held his tools, which included whips, chains, saws, knives, scalpels, needles, medical tools, fur-lined coffin, straps, electrical shock machines, leg spreaders, and a large array of sex toys. It also had a homemade generator for the electric shock tools, And on the walls were detailed diagrams showing how to inflict the most pain, disturbing pornography, and his homemade sadistic sex toys with nails bent and melted into them. These were obviously for pain and not pleasure. In the center of the trailer, like a display, is a gynecological chair with a mirror mounted above it, a rack and pulleys, levers, and chains to lift and move any victims that were there. A lot of his tools were handmade by him, as he was said to be very crafty. He would go to the hardware store and buy PVC and nails and make these sadistically disturbing sex toys and torture devices. David even would go on to make a wooden immobilizing tool that would bend the victims over. And then he would have his friends and even his dogs victimize these women. There were multiple locks used to keep all of his victims in the trailer so that they could not escape. There was also a checklist on the wall of how to control the abducted women. David would frequent bars and known prostitution areas in Albuquerque, Elephant Butte, and Truth and Consequences. He would also pose as a police officer to lure victims into his traps. Cynthia Vigil was a young woman who had had a rough life. She experienced molestation at a young age, and she ran away and lived with her mother, who partied and would even bring her along to the bars. Unfortunately, in 1992, her mother was murdered in Albuquerque as she was a prostitute in the area. And due to this, Cynthia would wind up in the juvenile system, eventually ending up in the same world her mother was in, the world of drugs and prostitution in Albuquerque, New Mexico. With this lifestyle does come its own dangers. And on March 22nd, 1999, while Cynthia was on her way to get breakfast at a local diner, a man she knew told her that there was a client waiting for her. And so she went. This man was David Ray, and he was asking for her by name. She went to his trailer where he offered her money for a blowjob. But after coming up from placing the money in her shoe for protection, David placed handcuffs on her. He showed her a badge and stated that she was under arrest for prostitution. She tried to fight back, but his accomplice slash girlfriend came from behind and shocked her with a cattle prod. They took her back to Elephant Butte Lake, where they stripped her down and chained her to a bed. David would play what would later be called his introduction tape to cause psychological torture to Cynthia. This tape would go on to describe what he was planning to do to her. The tape was made in 1993 and was used on who knows how many women at this point. I am not going to play a snippet of the tape as it is very disturbing. Plus, he does like to talk a lot, but you can easily find it on the internet. I just am not comfortable. However, I will read some beginning portions of it. This tape does start out with, "Hello there, bitch. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained, gagged, probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared too. I would imagine. Perfectly normal under the circumstances." This would go on for 40 minutes, just talking about what he's planning on doing with her, why he kidnapped her, and everything like that. The transcript for the tape is 19 pages long. If that gives any insight into how much he talked and described what he was going to do, he even states at one point, eventually you will settle down. So it's very odd that he would sit and record this tape, but this is what he used to psychologically torture his victims when they first came to be with him. Cynthia would go on to be raped, hung from a ceiling, drugged, and shot. After 3 days, David went to work, leaving Cindy in the trailer with Cynthia. He had decided that she was doing well And so he tethered her to the bed just by a chain around the neck instead of around the neck, hands, and feet as she had previously been chained. Cindy would go to walk away to take a phone call, and Cynthia would notice that the keys were on the table in the room. She attempted to grab the keys to free herself. And in doing so, the table that they were on snagged on a rug, making noise. Cindy then noticed what was happening and was trying to keep Cynthia there. In an attempt to keep Cynthia there, she attacked Cynthia with a lamp. During the altercation, Cindy was stabbed by an ice pick in the head, and Cynthia ran out of the trailer butt naked with the chain still around her neck. She had managed to get the keys, unlock the chain, and run out butt naked. She actually had grabbed an ice pick and she stabbed Cindy in the head or the face or the neck, somewhere on the side of her head to try to get away. Cynthia started running, looking for any signs of help. She flagged down a car that stared at her and just kept driving, which is unfortunate, but she was able to keep going. After 3 days of torture and drugs, somehow she had the strength to keep running for safety. After running, she ran up the road and ran straight into a random woman's trailer with the door open. The woman was at the sink doing dishes when a fully naked woman comes running in screaming for help. I can just imagine what her brain is thinking at that point. Like, I'm just doing dishes in my trailer, and this fully naked woman with a chain around her neck comes running in screaming that she had been kidnapped and tortured for days. Not only is Cynthia fully naked, she's also covered in blood from her torture and then from her fight with Cindy to try to escape. The woman called for her husband, who was in shock by the scene that he walked into. She then tells him to get a robe and call 911. They covered Cynthia in a robe and they promised no one would hurt her again. The police came and took her to the hospital where she was questioned, and she tells them that she was held for 3 days, chained to a bed with a bucket for a toilet. During the interview, however, she heard on one of the officers' radios that they were bringing in Cindy due to her stabbing injuries. Unknown to Cynthia at this point, the police are not fully believing her story. She is a drug addict, she is a sex worker. And so they're like, well, maybe she just got high and doesn't remember what happened and she consented. You know, they're not saying this out loud, but it's what they're thinking because of the lifestyle that she's in. After Cynthia hears Cindy's name come across the radio, however, she panics. She said that that's the woman who kept her locked up for days. She doesn't want to be anywhere near her. Please keep her away. And this is when police decided to go and question Cindy and go to the trailer where her and David were living. When they get to the trailer, all the pieces of Cynthia's story started falling into place. There was obvious signs of a struggle that had been had in the home. They find the room with the bed and the chains attached to it. They find the broken lamp on the floor and they find the bucket that Cynthia had been using as a bathroom. They decide that they need to look even deeper into this home and what is going on because something is just not right. With the obvious need to now search not only the home, but the property in general, the police take Cindy and David into custody and they search the home intensely. They then begin to question David at this point, and he tells them a completely fabricated story. What else would he tell them? He tells them that he did have Cynthia at his home. That's not a lie. And that he did have her chained up, but he was helping her detox and that all of the sex was consensual because she was a sex worker and he paid for it. So as they search the home, they go into the yard and they do find the trailer. It is a big storage trailer just in the middle of the yard, and the police stated that this space was evil. They knew that they were dealing with someone who found this trailer and torture very important. They also said that they knew that people had died there just by walking in and seeing what it was like. The police would say that in the trailer, they found signs that would point to demonism as a motive. On the walls, they found signs that said Satan's Den and the lore of Satanism. They also found an RCA video camera pointed right at the gynecological table, and they found a clipboard of dates and possible marks pointing to how many victims David had taken. There was also Polaroid pictures of his victims in different forms of torture. And the police began to look at the video that was in the video recorder when they showed up. This video shows a very drugged, very unconscious, in and out of consciousness woman tied to a chair. And he would play his tape talking about hypnosis. And these tapes, all of these tapes, there was more than one, were upwards of 40 minutes long. David would go on about sexual acts that he was going to do to these women and everything else in between. They would send the video to the FBI to see if they could determine the victim's tattoo that was on her ankle to identify her. And apparently, it was a very unique tattoo. The police put out a picture of the tattoo asking for support in finding the person who it belonged to. And this help from the FBI would lead them to a woman who is now living in Colorado named Kelly Garrett. Kelly lived in Truth and Consequences, and she had a peaceful life until July 24th of 1996. Kelly was married and living her life, but on July 24th, her and her husband would have an argument, and Kelly decided to meet up with friends of hers and that she had known for years and years at a local bar called the Blue Water Saloon. Here she would run into another old friend named Jessie. She gets a beer and she takes a drink. She's playing pool with her friends and she's just talking and enjoying the night. She goes on to take another sip of her beer. And while talking to her friends about what was going on with her and her husband, she starts to feel a little bit funny. She says she starts to feel uneasy. She starts to feel uncomfortable. So as the night goes on, she's not feeling great. And she asks Jesse for a ride home. What happened though is that during the night, Jessie had roofied her and decided that she was going to take her back to David. She wakes up 2 days later, covered in blood, in shock, and unable to remember anything from the prior 2 days. She finds her way home from where David had dumped her with a slit throat, leaving her for dead. She goes to talk to the police, but there was not a lot of information due to her lack of memory of the events that happened. She would not be believed by her husband or the police, and we would later find out exactly what happened. Which was that, as I said, Jessie roofied her. Kelly asked her for a ride as she was feeling ill, and she felt comfortable asking Jessie for a ride because she knew her and had known her for years. After getting into Jessie's car, she would black out completely. Jessie took her to her father, David, who put a dog collar and chain on Kelly, raped and tortured her, kept her in and out of consciousness with roofies for days. And then when he was done and he noticed that she was still breathing, he would slit her throat, thinking that he killed her and dump her on the side of the road near Caballo. Her husband believed that she was cheating and they would divorce, and she moved to Colorado. She would go on to do a cold case interview where she stated she was having nightmares of being held down, raped, and having objects put inside of her. She believed it was just stress at the time from not knowing what had happened to her. And in 1997, another woman would go missing from the Blue Water Saloon. Her name was Marie Parker. She was a mother of two, and she was dating a man named Dennis Yancey. Her friends reported her missing, but with her being a drug addict, the police did not take the information too far. Marie never turned up again, and another woman named Angela would come forward right after the news that broke that Cynthia Vigil had escaped a tortured situation. She had told the police prior to Cynthia about the trailer, the toy box, and her being a sex worker. They didn't take it seriously. She followed up with the police about her case in connection with Cynthia's case, and the police just needed to find more information. They needed to find a connection between David, Cynthia, Marie, and Kelly. They needed to find that connection. It wasn't hard though, because just months after Marie disappeared, David would show up at Marie's apartment. He stated that he was a friend of hers, that he was checking in, and he also said that she had borrowed money from him and he was trying to get it back. The FBI got involved as this case was blowing up out of proportion. Cindy Hendy, his girlfriend, who was described as a Christian music enthusiast and dog lover, began to be questioned by the FBI. And she decided it was in her best interest to cooperate fully. Cindy would go on to tell investigators that she participated in multiple assaults, and she also said that she knew that David had killed some of his victims and dismembered them, disposing of them in the Elephant Butte Lake. He also apparently told her that he knew he had been tipped off to the FBI because they had questioned him about his slavery and sex trafficking ring in the past. She would go on to say that he did sell women to other traffickers and that he viewed women as property and not people. He would call the women that he killed packages, not victims, not women, not anything else. She would also say that he would take pictures, but he would burn them after some time because he didn't need them anymore. This, however, destroyed important evidence that the police could have used. She would go on to describe She would go on to describe how when he first started disposing of the bodies, they would float back up. And so he would dismember them and anchor them down with rocks and bricks into the Elephant Butte Lake. Investigators at one point did find a map marked with X's around the lake, but searching a lake for bodies, especially dismembered bodies, is very difficult. At this point, the FBI has now turned this case into a serial killer case. During this investigation, Jesse Ray's once girlfriend, Jill Troya, is brought back up by her mother as she was last seen dining with Jesse at Frontier Restaurant, and they would get into a fight. Jesse supposedly drove back home with David, leaving Jill at the restaurant. However, Jill was never heard from again after this night. Cindy was arrested for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, accessory to criminal penetration, and she was sentenced to 36 years in prison, but only had to serve 19 years. She was released in 2019 and she moved to Kent, Washington as a level 2 sex offender. The community was outraged that she moved to by her being there. Apparently, no one had told them that she was moving there. No one had informed them that a level 2 sex offender would be there, and there was children and a school very close to where she lived. When questioned, Jessie Ray, who at the time lived with her mother but was known to be a violent drug dealer, would go on to say that the girls that would be brought back to the toy box would be raped, and she knew that, but she did not participate in anything that happened to them. She would talk about how she was the one who had originally reported David to the FBI years earlier about his slavery and trafficking ring, but nothing came of that. Jesse was arrested in April of 1999 thanks to the statement of Kelly. Jesse was charged with kidnapping, criminal sexual penetration, criminal sexual contact, and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 30 months and 5 years probation after pleading no contest. I am not sure what happened to Jesse after that. I couldn't find any information. Dennis Yancey, who was Marie Parker's boyfriend, was arrested in connection to all of this in 1999, and he did plead guilty to her murder in 1997. He said that he helped Jesse lure Marie to David's trailer, where David forced Dennis to strangle her to death. There was no evidence to back this up, unfortunately, and he was charged with kidnapping, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit a crime, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to 30 years, but he was released in 2010 on probation. 3 months later, however, he broke parole and was returned to prison until 2021. The question stands now, what happened to David? David went through all of this. David was the biggest offender in all of these crimes, and David was even the one to lure and kidnap these women to their doom. David would go to trial for Cynthia, Angela, and Kelly in 2001, but the trials were separate. This hurt some of the case as the women could not corroborate each other's stories on the witness stand. The judge also said that the raid on the trailer, including the audio tapes, could not be used in the case for Kelly or Angela, only in the case for Cynthia. Kelly's case was ruled a mistrial after 2 jurors said that they found her story unbelievable. David would continue to state that the trailer was a part of his fantasy life and all sex that was had there was completely consensual. He was retried and sentenced to 12 counts for her kidnapping. He showed no remorse. He stated that he was the victim and they were after him. Unfortunately, they could only try him on these 3 cases because of lack of evidence for any other cases. But the FBI felt confident from his handwritten journal and information found that they had a solid case stating that they had premeditation and lack of insanity. They also felt that they had at least 40 other victims. After the trial for Kelly, the trial for Cynthia would begin. But a week into the trial, David accepted a plea deal in exchange for his daughter Jessie receiving a reduced sentence. We have to remember that Jessie only got 30 months for her participation in all of this. So clearly, she received a reduced sentence. David was sentenced to 224 years in prison for multiple crimes, including abduction and sexual torture of 3 women. On May 28th, 2002, David was taken to Lee County Correctional Facility for interrogation. As he told police, he would tell them the locations of all of the other bodies. Unfortunately, before the interrogation could even start, he died of a heart attack. The FBI believed that David had at least 60 victims, but they will never know exactly how to locate them or any of the remains of his victims that he disposed of. The thought of how many victims he had comes from his handwritten journals that they found in his home and the trailer. He, however, never shared where the bodies are, and they could be anywhere in the area, as it is a vast desert and there's the Elephant Butte Lake. In 2002, the toy box was opened to the public, which I find is a very poor decision to make. But it was open to the public so that people could view it and hopefully jog memories of some unknown victims that might be out there. Cynthia Vigil, who now is stricken with permanent nerve damage from her torture by David, founded a nonprofit called Street Safe New Mexico, which is to help women in the sex work industry stay safe and informed. She did this with reporter Christine Barber. In 2009, skeletal remains were discovered in West Maze, which led to further investigations. 11 female bodies were found. Almost all of them were sex workers, and they have not been tied to the case, but have started a whole nother investigation. If it was not for Cynthia being so brave that day and running as far as her legs could carry her, who knows what more could have happened. According to David, he had killed at least 1 woman a year since he was 14 years old and abducted 3 to 4 a month. Cynthia not only saved herself that day, but also so many other potential victims that David could have had. She continues to tell her story as a warning to others in this lifestyle that she has now left. She got clean, she got married, and she has raised an amazing family. David's sexually sadistic ways led to many lost and ruined lives, but the streets are now a little bit safer as he is no longer here. That is my case for today. If you have questions, comments, anything, please do not hesitate to comment below. If you have case ideas, by all means, you can share them. I have a Discord that you can go to. It is linked in my information. Also, if you like being here with me, please, by all means, subscribe so I can keep coming back. I hope you all have a great day. Have a safe weekend. Stay safe out there, and I will see you next time. Bye.